And it was Sunday, everything was winding down. I found a room with a TV in it, and me and my friend hauled my giant player in there and started running these Japanese animations, and the room filled up with people. They couldn't believe it. One of those people was Fred Patton. Fred Patton was a fan historian, not just furry, but science fiction, anime, fantasy, all that. He was tied in with Lossless, and after we'd run the tape several times with even people like Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle rooting for the giant robots, he said, we should do a screening at the Lossless Clubhouse once a month. So we started doing that, and through my friend Wendell, I met a guy named Robin Lydon and a lady named Judy Niver. Robin Lydon had taped Astro Boy off the air, black and white, when he was working on a job in Atlanta. It was the last station in the U.S. broadcasting that show before it went off the air. He gave us his tapes, we copied them. He had a friend named Mark Kausler who was a film collector. He would put 16mm reels together to show at Lossless, and he said, I'll show these at your meetings. So the five of us sat down at a table in a park in Burbank and said, we're going to start a club. And Fred and Judy said, well, animation is kind of an insider term back then, so we'll call it the Cartoon Fantasy Organization, because we're also going to show Japanese live-action fantasy series, like what eventually became Power Rangers. So it was called the Cartoon Fantasy Organization, CFO. And they liked my critters, Skill Tear. And I had used Skill Tear. Yeah, the animal with the antenna there.
It was one of the first original species in the fandom, and OCs are very important. So the fact that
I made those when I was in high school because I got tired in Star Trek of all the aliens looking like humans. all the intelligent aliens were humans. I thought I'm gonna make one that's an intelligent weasel. So that was where they came from.
And if you ever wondered, that's the exact same creatures on the fandom documentary as well, the cover of the fandom documentary.
Yeah, which they didn't tell me they were going to do. That was a surprise. I saw the first picture of the poster, I went, what? So they said, well, Theta is your Skill Tear. That's Theta up in the top corner there, the gray and blue one with the yellow chest. Oh, yeah. He's your Skill Tear. Make a Skill Tear for our club that's a different Skill Tear, and that is the one on the business card. That's Fanta. Right. And her partner was Cy, and one of the people in the club was my girlfriend, and I used to call her Fanta, and she started calling me Cy. Everybody started calling me Cy, and I thought, I kind of like that, so that'll be me. So there you go. That's the Cartoon Fantasy Organization still has meetings. It has a really good Facebook page with lots of information about Japanese animation and manga also. But the club went on for like 20 years, and at one point there were 10 chapters all around the country.
We mentioned the New York chapter for a bit, and they also had their own unique mascot as well.
Yeah, the New York chapter, one of the founders, that was Ken Sample, who was one of the first people who I think broke the mold on furry art by creating animal characters that just weren't people with animal heads on them. Really nice designs. And he created an animal called Anima. It was a fell insect, a little flying furry thing with dragonfly wings for the New York chapter. And some famous people went to those meetings, and it even turned out that the co-founder of the New York chapter went on to become the president of ASIFA Hollywood. It's weird how things do, kind of circle around. And it was me and June Foray, the famous voice actress, who was the president of the CIFA back then when I was hanging out with the club, that kept pushing and pushing them to look at Japanese animation, because they were looking at US animation, European animation. They weren't looking at Japan at all. And years later, Miyazaki won Best Picture in their own awards, which are called the the Annie Awards. So it finally happened. They finally looked at Japan.
There we go. And one of the things I've been trying to stress the importance of the early part of the panel was talking about the room party floor, how room parties were very, very important for the cons around the time. And you were helping with the Prancing Skilltear parties.
Yeah, what happened was we went to WesterCon, which is a regional science fiction convention that moves around depending on who bids on it. Happened to be in Sacramento that year in this Red Lion Hotel, had huge rooms, really nice rooms. We couldn't afford the rooms. We were across the street in a cheap motel. My good friend said, hey, why don't you guys throw a room party in our room tonight? And I'm going, okay, about what? Well, drag out your videotapes, your Warner Brothers cartoons, and that Animal Olympics thing you taped. And all that artwork people send you, just lay it out, display it. And I said, oh. He said, yeah, call it a Prancing Skilltear party. That Prancing Skilltear was the name I gave my house based on a pub name. It was actually kind of based on the Prancing Pony from Lord of the Rings. And that little logo in the bottom corner is the logo for the house.
And
so
this was before the term furry was even coined, so these were called the funny animal parties.
The term furry didn't exist yet. One of my roommates was to blame for that, and he wasn't even a furry. He was into D&D, but he had a BBS. How many people know what that is? Yeah, it's before the internet. People would have message boards on their home computers and a modem so people could call in and leave messages. So we had one in our house, and he used to do editorials about fans in the area. And when the people in Las Vegas started having meetings because they collected plush animals, they called themselves fuzzy fans. So at the time I was living there with several roommates, we were all into these animal characters, and he made up the term furry fans for us. And it kind of escaped. So we're stuck with it. Like Rodney says, it's easier to say than anthropomorphic.
Yes. So yeah, you were talking about the online community around that time, and this is where Furry Muck also kind of emerged during this time period. Also played a big role in the early fandom, but since we're specifically a convention history panel, how about we talk about how you migrated your Prancing Skilltear party to eventually become Conference?
What happened was we kept having room parties at science fiction conventions. Every convention we could get to. Many of them happened at a convention called BayCon in San Jose. And
so talk about BabsCon, the Brony convention I was at last weekend. They also have a room party tradition. They also came from that BayCon family.
Yeah, they were BayCon people started that convention too. Anime was getting huge at that point. The CFO had expanded. A lot of people were importing stuff from Japan. We were getting newer shows, better copies, and some of the people were even cutting deals to sell VHS copies in this country with the studios. What happened is they kept asking for convention space at science fiction cons like BayCon to screen anime. And they would make beautiful 200-page books explaining the shows because they weren't subtitled. They weren't dubbed either. And literally they took over BayCon. And at some point BayCon said, guys, we'd kind of like our function space back. Can you go off and do your own thing? So the following year was the first anime convention in San Francisco. which corresponded to Rodney, my partner, saying to me, "So, do you think we could have a convention for furries?" And I said, "I'll give it a try." So same year, we Conference Zero in Costa Mesa. And we just kept promoting it. We put flyers at comic stores. There was this really cool magazine phone book, fandom phone book, called the Fandom Directory. And you could buy mailing lists from them. They had thousands of people in their directory. And you could say, "I want a mailing list of everybody that's into cartoons, animation, funny animals," and they would send it to you. And you could print labels and mail stuff out. So we started mailing out postcards. "You want to come to a furry convention?" And 100 people signed up and 65 showed up. And Rodney and I said, "We'll do it again." And again, and again, and again. For 11 years, 8 of which there was exactly one furry convention in the whole world, and that was Conference.
And I have a chart here of some of the early ones. So we have it in Costa Mesa. It moved to Anaheim, and it seems like it moved back to Costa Mesa, then Irvine, Buena Park, and then San Diego. So
yeah.
It's like you moved around a bit. And you can see it was also the first furry con to cross the 1,000 attendee mark. So the equivalent we're talking about, Anime Expo was the first anime con to cross that number. Conference was the first to kind of cross that mark as well. And another thing I want to point out is because when you create a conference, you cleaned a lot of the model that the sci-fi cons also had, while anime cons and comic cons kind of made their own model, kind of shed off some of the sci-fi roots. It seems like these early furry cons kept a lot of the same models: the hotel block model, the staffing model, the one guest of honor, the programming track.
The way the programming track worked, the costume presentation. The anime conventions became more like trade shows, like comic conventions.
And one of the things I like to talk about is how you kept the cosplay masquerade that the science fiction cons had, kind of made it like the equivalent with the fursuits, and how you also marched the fursuiters through the dealer's den after, and that eventually gave birth to the fursuit parade.
Actually, that wasn't our design. What happened was at a convention called Method Fur Meet, a lot of dealers didn't have people to help them. They ran their tables by themselves. And the fursuits would be in a presentation, and they never got to see any of them. Not everybody wore their fursuits around the convention. Some people just put them on, gone to the presentation, took them back off again. So somebody thought this great idea of, okay, when we get ready to take the picture of all the fursuiters, before we do, we'll have them march through the dealer's room. And everybody thought this was a great idea. It's like, well, why not have them march through the whole hotel? Or march down the street in front of the hotel. And it just went up from there.
And some of the other stuff, you kept kind of the hospitality suite, which I would argue eventually evolved into the zoo after they got rid of the food that was normally served in the hospitality suite. But most importantly was keeping the room party floor, which I said, again, most of these conventions were born on the room party floor. So I think it was very important that the furry cons kept that tradition, which is why afterwards I would say, go check out the room parties here at this convention, because who knows what type of new cons will get born from these types of room parties. Some of the interesting elements, because you talked about how, I guess it was the furry stuff was kind of overwhelming BayCon, the anime stuff was overwhelming BayCon, which is why they had to kind of branch off. And it seemed like the very similar situation was happening out in the East, where a lot of the furries were kind of overwhelming PhilCon. You had in the Midwest, a lot of the furries were overwhelming Duck, and that eventually would give way to Midwest Fur Fest and Conference East, which was kind of the forerunner to what eventually became AnthroCon. And I actually was curious because it seems like a lot of cons use conference and were not connected, because Conference East was not connected to your conference,
They
right?
just asked us if they could use the name.
So back then, I was guessing, was the term conference like the genericized term for a furry con back then?
It became that, but not on purpose.
Okay.
That came from the fact that science fiction cons like to have their names as word puns that had the word con in them. You know, conflagration, conception, leprechaun, you know, those were all, you know. So we were going to actually call our convention Califer, interestingly enough. And then somebody else at the house, might have been the same guy, I came up with the idea for furry, said, why not call it conference, but FUR? And we went, yeah, that's kind of cool. So we did that. And then we ended up with Eurofurence, Russfurence, there's now Canference, kind of similar in Guadalajara, Mexico, the biggest convention in Mexico, Conferer. So yeah, and it was interesting because this is just an indication of what was going on. When people who came to the early conventions, who were science fiction fans, who were professional cartoonists or amateur cartoonists who want to be professionals doing artwork, had a circle of fans around them. That was all there was back then. Then things like Furry Muck happened. And we had a storyboard on our BBS a couple of years before that, where people could log on to the BBS and they had alternate names they could use and role play in a furry environment. It only took 2 or 3 weeks to get a response, because we had one phone line, 400 users. Some of the people on that storyboard started Furry Muck when they basically took a text-based D&D game, took the D&D stuff out of it, and made it a social environment. So it's kind of like Second Life or VR chat, except all you do is type at each other. So we promoted the convention there. A whole bunch of Furry Muck people came to our convention, and the original old guard, who were fans that took the fact that they had artists that they circled around is very important. All these new people suddenly showed up, and a few of those people didn't like the fact that a lot of the new people were LGBT. So some of those people said, we've got to stop this. We have got to clean up furry fandom, i.e. get the gay people out. So they decided to split the fandom up, or tried to, by saying there's furry fandom, bad, and anthro fandom, good.
So I don't have this slide up here in this version, but that's where the burn furs kind of came about. And that's actually where, even the modern day, you kind of have the anthro fans as representing this more conservative side of the furry fandom, trying to separate themselves with it. You could argue it kind of really got repopularized again with Anthro Northwest, which was specifically going to be a family-friendly con. Then all the other cons tried to copy using the Anthro motto. But I guess on the more positive side, I did want to quickly talk about a little bit about AnthroCon. Uncle Kage was invited after Conference East kind of was canceled, and AnthroCon Albany kind of took that place. Uncle Kage was made a community guest, and that year he was invited as a community guest. He left as the chair of the con. He wanted to move it down to his hometown, which was in Philadelphia. And he wanted to kind of get back in the good graces of PhilCon, and PhilCon wouldn't hear it. They said you have to get on your knees and beg, and then Kage literally got on their knees and begged, appealed to the PhilCon Constitution, which said they would have funds allotted to local conventions, and that's eventually what brought AnthroCon to Philadelphia. And then Pittsburgh came about and started pitching their city, and Uncle Kage was hesitant at first, but they made a convincing pitch, and that's how Uncle Kage was able to move to Pittsburgh. One of the things that Uncle Kage also changed was you had what was called the pet auction. This came from what was called the slave auction at science fiction cons, but pet auction, I guess, also sounded a little bit too adult. So under Uncle Kage's time, it was changed to a charity auction, and a lot of furry cons followed suit and had a charity auction. The pony cons that came after kept the charity auction. So this is when charity auctions kind of became the next default of the convention scene. And this was also a way for furries to re-ingratiate themselves to the local community. So like I talked about how the Trekkies before and how the Bronies later kind of got mocked by the mass media. So Trekkies came about right as local media was booming. So what are you going to do? You go to a convention and just kind of make fun of people dressed in weird outfits. Bronies came about when the online journalism started. So what are you going to do? Go to the convention, make fun of people dressed like ponies. Furries came around around the same times of the birth of the 4-hour news cycle. So again, a very, very similar situation. Unlike the Trekkies and the Bronies, the furries started to kind of isolate themselves in some of these early cases. They were afraid of media coming inside and making fun of them. So a lot of the furry cons kind of blacklisted media, said in the con book, if you invite media, you'll get banned, you get blacklisted. So what was, I guess since you're from that time period, I'm going to kind of talk about my interpretations of this period and see if it was correct or not. But if you go to almost any major city around the United States, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, San Francisco, there is a nice sized circle of people who like volunteering at cons. For example, they might not be a fan of Brony cons, for example, but they like volunteering at Balticon, BronyCon, Otakon, Baltimore Comic Con, and Baltimore, for example. They just love volunteering at conventions. And because of that, the anime cons and the comic cons during this period were able to kind of progress and integrate. Whenever new situations came about, they would adjust how they ran stuff. The furry cons, because they kind of isolated, only hired volunteers from within their own small communities. And because these furry cons were based off how 90s science fiction cons were run, kind of kept that science fiction con model for the next decade or so. So when I first started attending furry cons about a decade ago, they were still run very, very similar to how old school science fiction cons were run, because the furry community were only sharing from within themselves. It was only when the furry cons really started to open back up, probably around 2015, 2016, that they started to invite the new ways of how cons were run, and that's how furry cons were able to quickly catch up. But you could see some of the carryovers, because science fiction cons, most of them are very small, a few hundred to a few thousand. Most science fiction cons will never be more than 3,000 or 4,000 attendees. Furry cons, as we will see with Anthrocon, really, really boomed up in attendance, and eventually Midwest Fur Fest. And because of that, they didn't have the know-how to quickly adapt to growing numbers, unlike the comic cons and the anime cons. And so they were kind of in the dark for a long time. The badge pickup line, why they have long badge pickup lines, it's because they were still using the 90s model. Most panels at furry cons still do not have AV staff in the rooms, unlike comic cons and anime cons that have dedicated AV staff in the rooms. In fact, most panels at furry cons don't even have a break in between panels. That was something that science fiction cons did. They normally did not have a break. The break was only introduced later on with the comic and anime cons, and now a lot of furry cons are introducing the break, but if you go through some of the older ones, they don't have break in between, so it's kind of hard to clear the room if you need to present the next panel. So that was kind of my impressions. Is that kind of accurate?
It's kind of accurate. One thing that I had to learn, which I did by early web surfing, is that not everybody, a person becomes a furry because they're a furry. Everybody doesn't have that extreme attraction to animal characters. Usually, for most people, I hate the term normal, but most people, they sort of lose an interest in animal characters around puberty. It's like, that's kid stuff. I don't want to look at that anymore. I'm 13 years old, but I really want to be 30 as fast as I can, so I'm going to get rid of all that kid stuff. The ones who can't let it go become furries. So one of the problems that the furry family's always going to have is you can't explain it to someone who doesn't have the interest. The best you can do is an open-minded person will say, Okay, fine. You be you. Have fun. I'm going to go do my thing. But unfortunately, what we get instead is a lot of hate, misunderstanding, and the problem is that most people think animation in general is just for kids, which it's not. That comics are just for kids, which they definitely aren't. So if someone passes that threshold, 15 years old, and they still like cartoons, and then they get to 20 and they still like cartoons, there's something wrong with them mentally. They must be a pedophile. And that is almost universal, and I don't know if we'll ever get rid of it, unfortunately. So that held us back a lot. But I'll tell you something, although a lot of conventions, like comic conventions and science fiction conventions, do have volunteer staff, it's still hard for them to get volunteers. They have to come up with perks. You'll get a free membership next year. You get your own lounge. We have a room you can crash in. You don't have to pay for a room for the night. Whatever to get people to help, because you have to have volunteers. COVID, MFF has a policy where you have to be vaccinated. You have to prove you're vaccinated or prove you had a recent test. In order to do that, they have to inspect documents. This is a convention with 14,000 people, several thousand a day registering, and they didn't have enough volunteers. They had 8 stations. 8 stations for 3,000 people. That's how you get the long lines. I don't know if other conventions had that strict of a policy or not, but that's also why reg pickup is so terrible. Lots of comic conventions will mail you your badge.
And like I was showing earlier, the very first picture drawing someone did of Worldcon, it was of a badge pickup line. So the badge pickup line at the very first Worldcon continues to the modern day. So it's something that's always been around. Thank you for at least talking about that portion. Like, I think this is a rare opportunity to have someone who's actually involved with the early fandom come up exactly during the part where I was talking about, and I think you fill that up perfectly. Before I move on to the bronies, what's your impression on the how the modern furry cons evolved from the time when you started helping or organizing them?
Well, from what I've seen, they still follow the fan convention norm as opposed to the trade show. You know, if you go to MFF, you're still going to see multiple tracks of panels. You're going to see a huge dealer's room, an artist alley. You're going to see some kind of a costume presentation. They don't do a parade there, but they did, before COVID, have a huge room where they had people posing in front of backgrounds. And they'd have, like, all the circles were here, and all the wolves were here, and all the foxes were here, and they would change their poses so people could take pictures. And they would cycle you through. They had probably 5,000-6,000 fursuits at that convention. A parade would be ridiculous. Even Anthrocon is not doing the parade the way they used to. The only convention I know that still sticks with the parade out in the street is Furry Week in Atlanta. And they did that because Furry Week in Atlanta is the grandson of Dragon Con, which is one of the biggest, for years, one of the biggest general fan conventions in the world. And they would have a parade, an honest-to-good, sanctioned by the city of Atlanta parade down the street for their convention, for all the Star Wars people and Star Trek people and all the costumers and all that. And the fursuit parade is kind of taken over from, it's another version of that. But you're not going to get conventions as big as comic conventions. It's interesting, even they make mistakes. Comic-Con has a little convention in Anaheim called WonderCon. And they developed this thing where they had UPC labels, whatever, on your badges. So they decided they wanted to check and see which people came to what days. So they had these kiosks set up where you had to tap your badge to get in. It was a disaster. And this is a convention. I mean, San Diego Comic-Con is the largest fan media convention in the world. It's over 120,000 people before COVID. You'd think they wouldn't make a mistake like that. They did. And those kiosks now, they're gone. And the line problem for WonderCon is gone. So bigger conventions are getting better at handling that. The other problem with furry conventions is registration used to all be paper, all paper. Everything there were mail-ins, you had to take cash at the convention, which was hard to do. Nobody could take credit cards. And, you had people basically going through paper to see if you're registered or not and whatever. Then they started computerizing it, and unfortunately, computers weren't that reliable back then. So everything works fine when you test it, and the day the convention opens, everything breaks down. This doesn't just affect fan conventions, it sometimes affects where they are happening. For one Dragon Con, the computer that printed the key cards, the hard drive died the day the convention opened. So they couldn't make key cards for anybody. They had to station hotel employees on every floor, and that hotel is huge, to let people in their rooms until they could get somebody, because it was a Friday. And they called their IT people, and they were all gone for the weekend. So yeah, registration lines I think are going to be around for a long time, and hopefully, once again, if you can get more volunteers, you can solve that problem. Getting volunteers is tricky. Everybody wants to go to the convention and have fun. It's the old Henny Penny story. Henny Penny does everything to make the cakes, and then all the animals want to eat it. She did all the work, everybody gets to enjoy it. That's kind of the curse of putting on a convention.
All right, well, thank you very much for giving your talk on their history there.
You're welcome.
So again, like I said, it was a very rare opportunity that we had someone who was actually involved in the history I'm talking about actually here to talk about it. So I guess because of that, we are running a little late, but since this is the last panel in the room, we have about 5 minutes left. It ends at 9:15. I'm going to kind of give a little summary for the last portion of the panel. If you want, I think we're going to run over, since we're the last panel in the room. You're free to ask me questions afterwards. I'm going to show a little video of the final BronyCon concert. And if you want to check out this panel, I have another version online, so be sure to check that out. But within the next 5 minutes, let's see how much I can squeeze between the Bronies and the COVID cons. So let's quickly go. So the furry cons came about during what was called the comics crash and boom period. And this was a period where speculators markets became really big with the comic conventions. This is also where we get the birth of the pro cons. So a lot of cons that want to try to buy up these previously fan-run cons and kind of make them more corporate. So some of the early pro cons we had was Wizard Magazine deciding to buy up Chicago Comic Con and rebrand all these cons as Wizard World. So Wizard World Chicago. You'll see the same thing with Informa, Fan Expo, all these different groups trying to do this during this time period. But this is also the time period where San Diego Comic-Con, like you were saying, became really big. In fact, San Diego Comic-Con bought WonderCon, which was actually a separate con during this time period, and later bought APE, which was Alternative Press Expo, and San Diego Comic-Con changed its name to Comic-Con International. So like we were saying earlier, the fans, the comic book fans, anime fans, furry fans, were represented as these stereotypical, the same type of stereotypes they would put on the Trekkies. But there was a shift where cons now all of a sudden became popular. My theory was Robert Downey Jr. going to San Diego Comic-Con to announce, hey, I'm in this movie Iron Man, because if you want to think about what the general guests of honor were at these cons during this period, these were kind of B-list, C-list, small actors in the background of Star Trek shows, for examples. This was really the first time you had an A-list actor going to a con and announcing, hey, I'm going to be in this new superhero movie. And boom, after Robert Downey Jr.'s appearance, you saw Comic-Con tickets. You could buy a ticket the day of Comic-Con still. Go up to the door, buy a ticket for Comic-Con. After Robert Downey Jr.'s appearance, Comic-Con tickets will sell within minutes online. So that's part of my theory of how these cons became popular. Then you start to see this big mass market trying to promote this. You saw loot boxes, loot crates, Funko Pop, Loungefly, all these big corporations now trying to make a market of this geekish chic type culture. So you have this entire embracing of these conventions now, where now all of a sudden normies, quote unquote, were going to them trying to buy exclusive items. So like I was saying, you had a lot of big corporations try to go and take over these cons, and this is where we get the shift from pro cons now dominating the convention scene as opposed to the volunteer fan run cons like these cons are. And also a lot of these pro cons are in the gray area because a lot of them have volunteers, but they're a for-profit con. So technically they're supposed to pay them as employees, but they don't. So maybe the IRS is just not checking up on them, but it's technically...
Well, Comic-Con, hard to believe as it might seem, is still fan-run. It is still a fan-run, non-profit convention. They have managed to keep people from buying them for the entire time they've been in existence. But yeah, science fiction cons not only had the same problem, they had people starting conventions and then suing science fiction conventions because California had this weird law that said nobody can, if you're in business, nobody can start a business to undercut you. So this guy comes along late in the game and then claims, oh, I'm running a business and these guys here are having, they don't have a profit, so they're competing with me and putting me out of business. He, of course, lost.
And actually, a few years ago, there was a famous lawsuit with Salt Lake Comic Con being sued by San Diego Comic Con, and they lost. That's why Salt Lake Comic Con is now known as, I think, FanX. So that's another example of that.
Did Comic Con have trademarked?
Yeah, which is really weird because, like I was saying, New York Comic Con was technically the first to use the term Comic Con, and that's actually where the differences come because you didn't really trademark conference in the sense that you still allowed Conference East to use it.
The person who took over from us years later said he trademarked it because he wanted to make sure that when he got out of doing conference, there could never be another convention called conference. It took us a couple of years to find out that he lied. He didn't do any such thing. But by that time, we changed the convention name to Califer. And it went on for 17 years.
That's good.
I mean, if you say Southern California Convention, same staff basically from 1989 all the way through to 14, and then from 14 all the way through to 17, that's the longest furry convention run by the same people in the country. But it's gone now, and it was shut down because some alt-writer basically called up the hotel and basically lied to the hotel.
That's sad.
That's still happening.
Yeah.
The last three conventions that have happened, furry conventions that have happened all over the country and Canada, have all been slammed. People have called them anonymously and said, there's a bomb in the hotel.
Vancouver, Fernal Equinox, and then Motor City FurCon all had very similar experiences happening. And BronyCons as well. BabsCon, I didn't think BabsCon didn't have any bomb threats, right, or anything?
BabsCon...
It was mostly safe, right? Yeah, okay.
False alarm.
I thought AmphroCon got like a gun threat as well.
Yeah.
Yep.
This year,
Yeah.
last year.
HarmonyCon 2000.
HarmonyCon, definitely, because I remember I took a picture of that.
And then you've got the chlorine powder thing with
Midwest Fur Fest.
Midwest Fur Fest.
Um,
Thing is, almost, besides the copycat ones, besides the fact that people are copying other people doing it, there's about 3 people responsible for all of those.
Well, I think it's a wider social trend right now. Like, just look at what happened with that one drag show where they got the threats.
Yeah.
It's like it's a wider cultural trend, definitely. It's not isolated just for cons at this moment.
Right. So actually, raise of hand. Who here is a brony? Okay, we have some bronies. Who was at BabsCon last weekend? Okay, yeah, we have some BabsCon people. So we were talking about BabsCon coming from BayCon, but the overall brony convention scene, we could kind of say came from two sources, the furry cons and the Star Trek cons. So basically, brony cons were a hybrid of the Star Trek and furry cons. The first BronyCon, which was interesting because they actually trademarked the term BronyCon. So we kind of identify BronyCons as a genericized term, but no BronyCon can really use the term BronyCon because it's been trademarked. So we were at BabsCon, which was in the Bay Area. It's called the Bay Area Brony Spectacular, but if you go to any normie, they will say, oh, you're at the San Francisco BronyCon. Like, that's how they genericized BronyCon. But BronyCon was copyrighted, a trans individual. I'm going to talk about how, we were talking about how, I guess, the fandom didn't like some of the LGBT elements early on and wanted to excise them. The brony fandom had another interesting element where a majority of the original founders of a lot of these ponycons were all trans individuals. In fact, there's such a high population of trans females running these ponycons, it really changed how some of the dynamics were run, which I'll talk about later on. But specifically, it was a hybrid con between the Trekkies and the furry con. So it took kind of how the furries did dealers and programming, but paired it with how the guest model was done with the Star Trek cons. So brony cons were also very, very different. Because remember, the Star Trek cons, they could take a guest from any background episode of Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, all the way to the new J.J. Abrams movies and the new CBS Paramount Plus shows. Bronies are unique. In fact, they don't really care about the first three generations. They focus on the fourth generation, Gen 4. Even though we're on Gen 5 now, a lot of them haven't migrated there. So that means there was a very tricky situation. When the Star Trek con started, the original series was already over. So you could pull a lot of these retired actors into as a guest of honor for your con. The PonyCon started as season 1 was ending and season 2 was starting. And when you think about My Little Pony, there's only 6 main characters, voiced by 4 VAs. 2 of the VAs are very notoriously hard to get. So now you have all these cons fighting over these little individuals. So yes, you had BronyCon started, but within the first 2 years of PonyCons, you had like almost 50 PonyCons around the world happening at the same time. Put this into numbers. This is more PonyCons happening around the world than you had Star Trek, Doctor Who, Twilight, Harry Potter cons happening. And when you have all these PonyCons fighting for the same small numbers of VAs, it becomes very, very tricky. So Purple Tinker tried to create a system to kind of accommodate all these different VAs because they are still working. They could go back the next day saying, oh yeah, this PonyCon treated me bad. Let's not do these PonyCons again. And Hasbro could put down the ban hammer and boom, these cons cannot exist. Is very, very tricky situation they were on, and it almost ended with an event called Las Vegas Unicon that invited all these different people, actually here in Vegas. Yes, your hand, Therese.
We went to it.
You were there? Oh no!
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yes, so that's why I'm always hesitant whenever there's a con in Vegas because of Las Vegas Unicon. So you guys all might heard of DashCon. This was the original DashCon, and I will argue had a bigger impact on the overall convention scene than DashCon, but invited all these show staff, Lauren Faust, John Delancey as well. All of a sudden, the autograph money was being stolen. Sponsors who paid thousands of dollars to help back the con and get these fancy hotel rooms were being kicked out. Dealers couldn't even handle real money, had to use these fun bucks that they couldn't really exchange for money afterwards, and it all went downhill. The pony fandom was fighting around this time period. You had all these different groups, Equestria Daily, Derpy Hooves News, Everfree Network, all fighting to try to be the Uncle Kage of the brony fandom during this time period. But they all united, did a charity, and saved the con the best they can, and had an emergency meeting to prevent something from happening like this again, because this could have spelled the end for brony cons. And not just that, all cons had emergency meetings. The furry cons, the anime cons, the comic cons all saw what could happen with Unicon and decided to react against this. And the bronies created the next new department, the VIP Relations Department, also abbreviated as VIPR. Some cons call it the Green Room Department or the Guest Relations Department. But the bronies created the next new type of department that all the other cons later adapted. Specifically, how cons were doing their guest of honor around this time. Science fiction cons and furry cons normally have one guest of honor, so normally one professional or industry guest of honor, and maybe one fan guest of honor, and if you go to some of the older cons, they might have a ghost of honor. Anime cons and comic cons, on the other hand, fill their con books up with tons and tons and tons and tons of guests of honor. And sometimes these guests of honors are overworked. They have to do all these autograph signings, run to panels, and they get so miserable they never want to come back to the con again. The anime and comic cons are like, who cares? We have hundreds of artists we could pull from. We have hundreds of VAs we could pull from. So if you make one of your guests of honor very miserable, these big cons don't care. It's more restrictive at a pony convention. Like I said, you only have like a limited number of VAs to pull from. You cannot piss them off. So the VIP art department was kind of like a nice way to combat this, making sure the guests weren't overworked, that they had luxurious, a nice room. It was treated like a vacation for them. If they were stressed out with an autograph signing, with a panel, they would be able to cancel that or move it to another period. And a lot of cons then adapted this model later on. So this is where the Bronies started to do this with their department. They also had the equivalent to the fan guests of honor, which was the community guests, a completely different model. And so that's something that the Brony cons kind of adapted. Like I was saying, the Brony fandom was full of a bunch of trends individuals. So the Brony fandom was really the first to introduce a lot of different elements. So gender-neutral bathrooms were introduced en masse at pony conventions. They were also the first to do a lot of different things, like the pronoun ribbons. Yes, some furry cons and anime cons were doing pronoun ribbons beforehand, but the BronyCons as a whole were really the first to adapt pronoun ribbons, and BronyCon actually started to introduce the concept of the communication tags. I remember when people were saying, oh, MFF, that was great when they introduced the communication tags. Well, BronyCon was doing that 5 years before the furry cons were. The BronyCons also introduced a unique type of model of concert. So a lot of Brony furry concerts are now kind of taking cues from how Bronies are doing concerts and taking their AV team. So very quickly, there was a group called Kitty Corral. They created an organization called Corgi Events, made a bunch of PonyCons, Ponyville Cider Fest, Windy City PonyCon, decided, hey, we can make a lot of money doing fursuits, became Lemon Brats, started making a bunch of furry cons, even bought up Anime Milwaukee for a period, and then they completely collapsed last year, long story. But through Corgi Events, that's where a lot of the Bronies picked up a lot of elements. A lot of Bronies have also moved out of the fandom and created a niche on their own. And then BronyCon ended in 2019. Originally when I was writing my book, I wanted to end my book in 2019. This was the 80th Worldcon, the 50th San Diego Comic-Con, the final BronyCon, perfect place to end everything, but then a pandemic happened. But a lot of the Bronies started to migrate to the furry fandom, taking along their elements. That's why furry cons have now adapted the gender-neutral bathroom, pronoun ribbons, all that stuff. What's unique about BronyCons is it's always a fighting, sibling rivalry between furries and Bronies. A lot of furries are like, oh, Bronies are technically furries. But that's interesting because if we include BronyCon as a furry con, technically BronyCon will be the first furry con to cross 10,000 attendees. It did this years before MFF did. And if we actually consider that, that would mean BronyCon was the largest furry con in the country for at least 3 years, and it's still the third largest furry con of all time. I kind of want to show the graphs because I really think it's interesting how BronyCon really, so these are all the furry cons here. BronyCon really boomed in numbers. Now, remember when I was talking about the Star Trek cons really booming in the past, beating Worldcon, beating San Diego Comic-Con? The Star Trek cons also shrunk. The BronyCons also saw a shrinkage, and then MFF kind of took it over. BronyCon finished its final year really strong, setting another record. Again, probably a record that hasn't been beaten by any other con since, BronyCon since. In fact, most of the other PonyCons are really relatively small in comparison. So BronyCon was the weird outlier for that event. So just like Anime Expo was kind of the weird outlier for the anime cons, BronyCon was kind of the weird outlier for all these different PonyCons. But if we compare all these furry cons and BronyCons to the big cons, they're not even close. So we have Worldcon is still down here with all the furry cons. DragonCon is in yellow right here. So the one you were talking about that was the parent company of Furry Week in Atlanta. You have Anime Expo here in green, so just hovering above DragonCon. But then the two big ones are New York Comic Con and San Diego Comic Con. San Diego Comic Con for the longest time was the biggest pop culture con in America. It was quickly overtaken by New York Comic Con. Separate from the original New York Comic Con, this was a raid pop element New York Comic Con. Really took the numbers really big. But if we even compare these cons to Comic-Con, They're not even close to Comic-Con. And you have to remember, Comic-Con is essentially just a giant artist alley. There's no concerts, no programming, no panels. Comic-Con is just a giant artist alley that's held twice a year. So imagine an artist alley that bigger than all these other cons right there. That shows how crazy Comic-Con is. And Comic-Con is still kind of the big inspiration for how a lot of anime cons are being run. And all the little furry cons are still down here. So that just shows you the big dynamic of how these different genre cons had different attendees. Now, this comes into the issue we're talking about pro cons and fan-run cons. You have the issue of volunteer-run cons. I don't want to get a little bit into that since we're running late, so we're just going to get past that. But I did want to point out something funny. So the founders of the new New York Comic Con, I don't know what happened to them. I guess they must have fallen out because one of them went on to work for ReedPop. The other one went on to form his own company called Left View Media, which started AwesomeCon. And then they started to kind of compete with each other across the different genres because in the Pacific Northwest, you had two fan-run Comic Cons, Emerald City Comic Con and Rose City Comic Con. Used to be organized by the same group, but ReedPop eventually bought Emerald City Comic Con and Left View bought Rose City Comic Con, and they kept the same logos, which I thought was really funny. Then they started to move on to the anime cons, and ReedPop decided to make Crunchyroll Expo as their anime con, while Left View decided to make Anime NYC and Anime Frontier powered by Crunchyroll. So it seems just like these divorced parents kind of doing this incestuous copying of each other, which I really thought was really funny. But yeah, that's where the pro cons kind of get about. And it's like I said, Anime Expo, like we were saying, big cons also had issues. Anime Expo had some issues last year we don't need to get into, but then the pandemic happened, and this is where things kind of change. So bronies and furries were kind of the most tech savvy of these new cons, and I think this shows how well run bronies and furry cons were at this period, because when cons started trying to do virtual cons online during the pandemic lockdown, it was the furries and bronies who were really hosting the best cons. The anime cons and comic cons and sci-fi cons couldn't even compete. But the first virtual con actually started as a PonyCon. It started on a Discord server made by one of my friends, Ruth. She's in the dealer's den this weekend. She tried to make a dealer's group. And my friend Dex, who was the final vice chair of BronyCon, created PonyFest Online, which started to do a lot of integration. So they had panels through Zoom. They would later partner up with PonyFest, where you can make your own little Ponytown avatar, and then you could screen these panels and live concert events there. A lot of different online PonyCons follow this model. One PonyCon in Southeast Asia even created an entire convention center in Minecraft, and the furries, who didn't want to be one-up, decided to create their own convention centers completely in Second Life and virtual space. And then the furry cons online started to do a lot of great things as well. If you think about it, a digital avatar is essentially just a digital fursuit, so it kind of makes sense the furries would naturally migrate there as well. There was a lot of fun little online cons during this period. There was kind of a boomer Facebook group called Consolation, which was just a bunch of sci-fi fans posting cat pictures. Like, it was not really an online con, but it was like kind of a coping group for them to kind of get through. And FireCon, which was really interesting because it was specifically a convention aimed for Black science fiction writers and fantasy writers. You normally would not see that type of con happening in the real world since there wouldn't be enough interest, but on the virtual space, it allowed for the progress of cons like that. And a lot of cons, now that cons are back, they've kind of a lot of furry cons have integrated that online portion. I think this was at Megaplex, where you could kind of see the virtual space, where you could see the digital avatars interacting with the physical people, and I really like that the furry cons kind of have continued that tradition. So yeah, that basically concludes the entire history of the conventions. Like I said, the early science fiction cons that started in the 1930s. Eventually, as the Comic Cons broke off, the Trekkies helped inspire the multi-genre cons, and eventually the room parties that gave birth to the anime cons and the furry cons, like the one we're at, and of course the bronies kind of being the child of that. The other con group I didn't really mention, but the video game cons came off of the electronic trade shows, eventually copied the science fiction con motto and the Comic Con motto with the trade floors, and eventually kind of adapted that model as well. This is all one giant family tree. This is a way to show Comic Con, anime cons, furry cons, we're not separate. We're all siblings of this greater, larger history of conventions. And with that, thank you all for coming to the panel. Continue this tradition, go to the room parties. Hope you guys have a good time here. I'm going to end with the BronyCon concert, but if you need to leave, go on ahead. But again, thank you very much for coming to the panel. Enjoy your time here.
Hey, thanks.
And give our surprise guests a round of applause as well. So this is where I like to end when I do this panel at PonyCons, I like to end it with, just by coincidence, I was at the final BronyCon concert and I recorded. So I talked about the history of folk music, right? I think Bronies kind of continue that tradition of folk music because they create fan music based on the show. And the equivalent of the folk gathering, the Bronies kind of have a unique equivalent, the Renegade stage. So if you go to a PonyCon, you will have a Renegade stage. Just like how all the old folk musicians will go into empty panel rooms, strum the guitar, people will join in. That's kind of what the Renegade stage is. This is a song made by a trans musician in the Pony fandom. It's called Great to Be Different. I kind of cut it up to make it short. It's about 5 minutes long. I put a little slideshow at the end kind of showing the history of all these different cons, but I think the words kind of resonate. And if I ever made this panel into like a documentary, this will probably be the theme song of it because it doesn't represent just the Pony fandom. I think it represents all these different cons.